This is an ad for Roundup for Lawns. It kills weeds down to the root without harming your lawn. It works on crabgrass, dandelions, clover. It works on weeds with names you can't even pronounce. It's Roundup for Lawns. When used as directed, always read and follow pesticide label directions.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Illustration Department podcast. My name is Giuseppe Castellano. In this podcast, I talk to folks in illustration, graphic design, publishing, animation, and other creative fields about their work, the lessons they've learned, and the bumps and bruises they've experienced along the way. In this episode, my guest is Caldecott Medal-winning illustrator and author, Brian Selznick. A piece of advice you often hear at a children's book conference is, tap into your inner child. I thought I knew what that meant until this chat with Brian. Among other topics, Brian shares his detailed approach to illustration. We discuss what's wrong about tapping into your inner child if you're writing a children's book. And Brian reminds us that if you're going to compare yourself to someone, that someone should only be you. I hope you enjoy our conversation. In your commencement speech for RISD's class of 2020, you said you didn't study with Chris Van Allsburg or podcast guest David Macaulay. Judging by your work, I was convinced you had. Not saying you're a copycat. You just have the same level of classicism and artistry. When I look at your work, yeah, I see a little Allsburg. I see a little Macaulay. I also see Fred Marcelino, Robert Innocenti, and Nancy Burkhert. Do any of those names mean anything to you?
Yeah, they all do. They're all what I would consider a really extraordinary compliment. So I will start by saying thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
And I will say that even though I did not study with Chris Van Allsburg or David Macaulay, nor did I hear Maurice Sendack speak when he came to RISD in 1987. While I was there. That doesn't mean I didn't learn from them. Right. So what had happened was in high school, every adult who I knew told me I should become a children's book illustrator because it was the main job they could think of for a kid who could draw. Mm-hmm. My dad was an accountant and very concerned with money, but he also was incredibly supportive of my work as an artist. So everybody supported me as an artist, which was amazing. And I'm very, very appreciative of that. But I found the suggestion that I should illustrate children's books deeply insulting because I had just basically become not a child about 8 minutes earlier. And I very much wanted to be identified as an adult, as we often do when we're teenagers.
Sure.
What's important is you see me as the adult that I want to see myself as.
Right.
So I went to RISD with a very big chip on my shoulder regarding children's books and ended up doing theater up at Brown and decided to get into set design. And that's a whole other story. But
sure.
When I graduated college and did not get into the set design graduate school that I wanted to go to, I was forced to reassess and think about what it was that I do, in fact, want to do. Like, do I want to reapply to theater schools, which is what you normally have to do?
Right.
Do I want to do something else? And that was when I realized that what I love to do most is to draw. I've always liked telling stories. I've never minded kids. And I finally, as a college graduate, realized that I should, in fact, be a children's book illustrator, by which point I knew nothing about children's books. So a friend of mine suggested that I get a job at a children's bookstore. That way I could read the books and meet the customers and learn about the history of children's books. And I sort of lucked my way into Eeyore's Books for Children on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which at the time was one of the oldest children's bookstores in the country.
Oh, yeah. Heard of it.
And by the great grace of the universe, Steve Geck was the manager who took pity on me because I knew nothing about children's books, which was the one requirement to get the job. Mm-hmm. and hired me. And he basically sent me home every day with bags of books to read. And I mean, it was practical, right? Because I needed to recommend books to the customers. When people came in saying, there's a book that I remember that has a blue cover, with a tree, I had to be able to tell them what it was.
Right.
So I needed to know all those books for my job. But also Steve grew up in a bookstore himself. He would send me home with new books, old books, all the great books that we had at the store that he was the buyer for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I first re-encountered the work of Chris van Allsburg, re-encountered the work of David Macaulay, actually studied Maurice Sendack for the first time. I did not have his books when I was a kid.
Right.
In fact, I didn't have any of these people's books when I was a kid. The only person's books I had as a kid was Remy Charlip, who did Fortunately, and a lot of really
fellow set designer.
Yes, and he he was the one person.
I think he did Dead Bird too.
Yeah, he
Margaret
did the
Wise
Dead Bird
Brown's.
with Margaret Wise Brown.
Yep.
And 13, and a lot of really experimental books. He was very concerned and interested in what happens when you turn the page in a picture book and all the extraordinary things that can happen.
And also an incredible costume designer as well.
Yeah, and he was a dancer, and he worked with deaf theater and was a incredible raconteur. He was a teacher at Sarah Lawrence.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually became friends with him. He ended up posing as Georges Méliès in The Invention of Hugo Cabret.
Right. And he proved that you don't have to be just one thing. Another one of your gems in that speech.
Yes, the realization that you don't have to be just one thing was very big to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was reading all of those books that Steve Geck was giving me where I discovered the work of Nancy Burkhert and Fred Marcelino and so many other folks. And so I was looking at all of their work very, very deeply, looking at the technical aspect of the drawings themselves, and then probably starting with Maurice Sendack, and then Arthur Jorings and Richard Egelski, who also did a series of collaborative books that were very important to me in terms of teaching me what the possibility of narrative inside the structure of a book could be.
Right.
And when I began to work on my first book, it was with the lessons that I had gleaned from all of those books. And then, I like to draw with cross-hatching. I did my first book in Bic pen. And I think a lot of the people who you just mentioned, who you see inside my drawings, also have an interest in a certain kind of realism, a certain way of laying out the images. And I think that was important to me.
Interestingly, Eeyore's bookstore and Books of Wonder, Peter Glassman, podcast guest, Flex, were Nora Ephron's inspirations for You've Got Mail.
Yes.
And Peter Glassman even said, he wrote a piece about whether or not it was actually Books of Wonder entirely or Eeyore's, and it was a little bit of both.
Oh, I don't know about that piece, because Nora Ephron was one of our customers. Her son was someone who we hired to wrap Christmas gifts when he was a teenager, and we had Barnes & Noble open across the street from us. We always felt pretty clear that we were part of the creation myth of that story. But I also know that Nora Ephron and Peter Glassman were friends, and that it's very obvious that Books of Wonder is also a part of that. And I know that they provided the books for the set when they were making the Shop Around the Corner, the little independent bookstore that Meg Ryan owns in the film.
Yeah.
But yes, I always feel like, when I think about that movie, that we lived it.
Yeah. It's funny. When I was doing research for you, I wish I'd found more similarities, because, I would love to have a Caldecott medal myself, but alas, I don't. But I did also go to RISD, not necessarily to study illustration. In fact, I got there greasing the wheels for my dad, who was not an accountant, but also worried about money. So I went there for architecture. All I wanted to do was be a fine artist, but I wanted to be more of a figurative fine artist. And at the time, I didn't see that much in the painting department, so I chose illustration. And then right at the very last second, was introduced to children's books. I didn't know a thing about children's books. And so instead of working in a bookstore, I worked at Simon & Schuster. And that's how I was introduced to your work. Because I think the first thing I saw of yours was it Frindle? I think it was Frindle. Because I started in 99. Frindle was published in 96 or 7.
Yeah.
Who was the art director for that? Was it Lee Wade or Ant Bobko or Paul Zachris or neither of those?
I have worked with all of the people you just mentioned over the years because I did many, many Andrew Clements books.
Yep.
I remember that Stephanie Lurie was the editor for Frindle, and I can't remember which of the 3 amazing people you just mentioned actually started with Frindle and who I worked with a little bit later.
Yeah, it was Aladdin. I don't remember who the art director was for Aladdin at the time.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a good experience. Although I had this funny moment where I had done a cover. I had finished the cover for Frindle, which was a kid standing like the Statue of Liberty with a pen up over his head against a blue sky with a red frame. And the sketch had been approved and everybody loved it. And Stephanie Lurie, after I had finished the book, told me that she/they decided that the cover wasn't good enough and they wanted something more, as she put it, in your face. And I really don't like doing anything over. And I was very frustrated because they had given me, I had shown them sketches of that idea. They had given their approval. And so I got a little frustrated and I said that I didn't want to do it again because they had approved it. And she said, well, if you don't do it over, we will fire you from the whole project. And I really loved the book and I loved the story. It had made me cry the first time I read it. And I had spent many years making books that nobody read. I really did not want to be severed from this project. But I was annoyed. I was really mad. And so I sat down and I was like, all right, you want something in your face? I will give you something in your face. And I thought of the kid with the holding a pen, sort of hitting it right towards the viewer.
Right, literally putting it in her face.
So it came out of a very literal reading of the note, we want it more in your face.
Right.
But that is an exponentially better cover than the one that had been rejected. And so I think about that a lot.
Don't you hate it when that happens?
Yeah, I know. I get annoyed, but I try to think about that when I'm hearing notes that I may disagree with, because sometimes it will lead to something much, much better, and you don't want to deny that.
No. Paul Zielinski had a similar experience with Dear Mr. Henshaw. He had done a cover that he liked. The editor and someone else, maybe marketing, the art director also liked. The editor and marketing didn't. They had asked some third-party, firm to put together some sketches or a sketch and sent it back to him, and it was obviously terrible. Long story short, they ended up going back to his original design. In some ways, I feel like it would be nice to have like a little bit of maybe one page at the back of these books describing what went through the artist's mind and what the process was for the cover.
And I think maybe the real message about this is that it's really hard to make a cover where a kid is holding a pen.
Yeah, so don't ask illustrators to do that because it's not easy.
Because Mr. Henshaw, the kid's writing, right?
Yes, he is.
And holding a pen.
Oh, yeah.
Usually as a reader, as an admirer, we look at, all we see is the finished work. Even if we're doing a million drafts ourselves, we still somehow convince ourselves that other people's processes are easier, simpler, faster, better than our own. And it generally turns out that everybody has their own difficulties and their own, and then there's always lots of interesting stories leading to whatever it is you're looking at.
A lot of illustrators suffer from that when they look at social media, but I don't want to talk to you about social media. Let's keep going. There's one more artist that came to mind, and that's Eric Beddows. He worked right around the time you would have turned your attention to children's books after RISD. He illustrated Paul Fleischman's Joyful Noise, which was 1989, and Shadow Play, which was 1990. Look him up after the chat or later on or whenever, because you'll see what I'm trying to get at. Beddows said that for him, what he didn't want to do was fudge the illustrations. He didn't want to fudge the information especially the secondary and tertiary and less important elements of an illustration. In other words, everything in his drawing, and I'm going to include you in here, obviously, was carefully crafted with the utmost attention. And I think that's a pretty concise way of describing your work. Is that your approach to narrative illustration? Or you can answer either one or both. What are you hoping to achieve with your work? I know that's a big question. I know you've been working for many decades, but try.
It's so funny because when you quoted Eric Beddows' desire to not fudge anything, I had this sort of instinctive feeling that my objective is the opposite.
Huh.
But I get it, right?
I have been known to be wrong with my assessment of an illustration from time to time. It doesn't happen very often, though, Brian.
I mean, literally, you're not wrong, right? Because I'm very obsessed with detail. I'm concerned with bricks and cobblestones and clouds and leaves. That ain't fudging, right? So, and in fact, I will redo obscure parts of my drawings if I find out that there's something factually incorrect in them. I did a picture book about Walt Whitman, and I did a drawing that I had done so much research for of Whitman as a kid working in a printer's shop, and I had drawn a whole printer's drawer pulled out with all of the alphabet letters, that are carved backwards for the old printing presses, and I had every single letter drawn and the blank spaces, and I showed it while I was working on the book to another printer who I met in the process, and she looked at it for about half a second and said, "Oh, that's a printing drawer from 1893, and Whitman was working in 1862, but no one will ever notice." And I was like, "You've got to be kidding me!"
Like, well, I
knew, right? And so I redid it.
Yeah, of course, you have to.
And I did for Run Away With Me, my new book. I have a lot of drawings of cobblestone streets moving through the city of Rome in the beginning. And I showed my first version of one of the cobblestone streets to a friend who lives in Italy. And she goes, "Well, you drew them all lined up and perfect."
Right.
Because I'm also working at 1/4 the size of the finished drawing. And she said, "But again, no one's going to notice except people living in Rome that those aren't actually Roman cobblestones, because Roman cobblestones either never line up or they're done in sort of a fan shape that I had somehow either not noticed or didn't think I was technically capable of drawing at this tiny scale."
Yeah,
but because she noticed it, I redrew it.
Yeah. You bought extra kneaded erasers and
yes, and I work under a magnifying glass, on an arm with a light in it, and have my, Stadler Mars drafting pencil and the pointer.
I'm sorry, Brian. That's the opposite of fudge, man.
Right. So literally, I am not fudging. I am interested in the specifics of the details, but the main concern is, and I'm sure this is, or I'm guessing this is probably what Eric Beddows would have said as well, is his main concern is what's happening narratively in the story.
Definitely.
Right? What's the purpose of the drawing? Where's the main character? How does he get your eye? Again, I don't want to speak for him, but I'm guessing that his concerns would not be that different than any other illustrator's concerns, like myself.
Yeah.
That we're trying to get your eye to go where we want it to go. We're trying to get the story to be told in the most interesting way possible. We're trying to add something to the world of the narrative, which Maurice Sendack called illuminating, not illustrating. You don't want to just draw what it says. You want to add something so that everything is necessary together to understand this third new thing, which is not the story, not the pictures, but what happens when the story and the pictures are together.
Yeah.
So maybe I guess what I'm saying is that even though I'm in agreement with what he's saying about not fudging the details, all of those details for me feel like they're there to get your eye to go where I want it to go.
Right.
So it feels like the intention might be slightly different, but I hear what he's saying, and maybe I just talked myself into actually sounding like I'm in complete agreement with him, which maybe I am.
Well, I think this is what I'm hearing from you. I've talked about this a little bit on the podcast, and I've been struggling for quite some time to come up with a new word to replace details. Because I think when people hear details, they think decoration. Detail, in my view, when I talk to illustrators, when I mentor illustrators, detail isn't meant to just decorate. It's meant to inform. And it's meant to further deepen the storytelling. So, for example, I mentioned Gustave Dore. So there's a piece of his, anyone can look this up, in which he does Puss in Boots.
Yes.
And you see Puss in Boots in the foreground, and he's sort of like arms in the air, claiming victory over something, it looks like. And there's like a weird dude in the swamp behind him. I can't quite figure out what's going on back there. But anyway, if you look closely, you'll see he's got a little sack on his belt with dead mice. Yep. There's like a little rat tail coming out of it. He's got a necklace. And at first you think, if you don't look at it carefully enough, you just think it's a necklace. Maybe it's some jewels or something. But if you look closely, it's bird skulls.
Yeah.
He could have, and I see this often these days, when an illustrator will quote unquote decorate or add detail, they just sort of add detail willy-nilly without much thought to how it helps the character's personality or how it helps the environment, what it tells us about the environment. Is it a bedroom of a family that's well off, or is it a bedroom of a family that isn't? The details tell the stories. Again, I hate the word because I just don't think that fully explains what we're here trying to say, including what Eric Beddows is trying to say.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just a word, but I think the idea.
Brian, you don't know me, but you will know eventually over the next 10, 15, 20 minutes that I just obsess over this stuff, and so much of it doesn't make any difference.
No, but I think that's what's exciting, and that's why it's interesting to chat with you about the work, is because it matters, and because the word detail is a detail that matters in a way that the parts of a drawing that you might overlook or that you might miss because they're smaller, because they're more specific, may matter or not matter, right? Like you could look at this picture of Puss in Boots relatively quickly, and you get the drama of the gesture, you get the fact that he's victorious, you get, you can see pretty quickly at least one of the mice hanging from his belt and this little sack that you were describing with the tail sticking out of it. And so I don't need to know or to notice that there are bird skulls around his neck, but I see that he's wearing jewelry. I see that he's a bit of a fop, and he's got his cape, and he's got a feather, and he's got, it's a gestural item, but then, or gestural, image, but then every place that you look into, you discover more information. There is more. It's sort of like rewarding you for caring and rewarding you for looking. Yep. I'm guilty of this a lot, where I feel like the second I see something, I think I've seen it, so I can move past it. It's sort of why people walk quickly through art museums, because you look at a painting and your brain convinces you, if you're a sighted person, that you have seen it. You looked at it and you have seen it, and now you can move beyond it. But if you force yourself to stop, especially if it's like an abstract painting or like a Rothko, where it's mostly like two or three, it seems to be two or three colors, you think, okay, it's two or three colors. But then if you stop and look at it, and you find yourself discovering the depth of the paint and sometimes you can see the actual canvas through the paint itself. You can see, bristles sometimes from the brush, or fingerprints that the artist put in when they moved paint with their fingers. So you're rewarded for giving the piece time. And that, I think, is maybe what you're getting at, or what you're interested in or frustrated by with the word detail, because detail seems to be something, frivolous, like architectural. You think about architectural detail could be, like the trim around the roof, or if you're an architectural historian, that's not trivial. that can tell you a lot of information about the time period and the amount of money that the person had and the building materials. But it is all covered by the word detail.
Right. I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but I live in a house that on the front of the house, there are shutters on either side of the windows. They are decorative. They do not work. One could see that as a detail. Oh, look at that nice detail. But it's superficial. It has no meaning. It has no purpose. So I guess that's sort of how I see this kind of conversation, especially when I'm conducting portfolio reviews with illustrators. That's what I'm talking about. Like, don't do the shutters. Do the pouch with the dead mice is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so then I'll just be the devil's advocate.
Go ahead.
And say that shutters aren't useful in that you can't close them during a storm and protect the glass in the window the way shutters are meant to work. But if you take those shutters off of your house, visually, it will fall apart. Visually, the windows will look bad. They will look incomplete. So they are serving a purpose. It's just not the purpose actual shutters are there for, why we're used to seeing shutters, right? We're used to seeing shutters because they were first put on to serve a practical purpose. We're going to get a storm. I need to close something. It would be great if they were just screwed to the house so I could just close them. Or if I wanted privacy, I could close them.
Right.
But now, if we don't have decorative shutters, and you don't always need decorative shutters, and sometimes a house without decorative, I'm not making an argument for or against decorative shutters, but I just want to make that clear. But
good.
They may just serve a different purpose. They're serving an aesthetic purpose.
Right. Back on the rails, because I did not have...
I could go on.
Did not have talking about home decor with Brian Selznick in my notes, but I'll just add them later.
You never know where it's going to go.
You never do. This podcast is produced by the Illustration Department, a global leader in online education for illustrators. Visit illustrationdept.com for offerings like mentorships and portfolio reviews, testimonials, our alumni showcase, our best-selling Substack, and more. That's illustrationdept.com. And now, back to our conversation. I'm trying to think, like, how do you transition from shutters to the Houdini box? I'm just going to go ahead and do it. So, yeah, the Houdini box was the first book you wrote, first picture book you wrote and illustrated, and that was published by another SNS imprint, Athenaeum. This is a couple of years after RISD. Eeyores closes in 93. The Houdini box is 91. Mm-hmm. How touch and go was your publishing career in those first couple of years? I
published the Houdini box while I was still working at Eeyores. It was actually first published by Knopf at Random House. And then my editor, Ann Schwartz, eventually moved over to Simon & Schuster. And many years later, we also moved the Houdini box over to be with Anne at Simon & Schuster.
Yep.
And, and then I did a new cover, and the book remains in print. And so it's been steadily in print since it was published in 1991.
And this is for folks, just to connect the dots, Ann Schwartz and Lee Wade, who we mentioned earlier, are now Schwartz and Wade at Random House.
Yeah, and they're amazing.
Same folks.
And Ann Schwartz is the editor who got this Xeroxed manuscript and this Xerox set of drawings that I had put together, and worked with me for about a year to get it ready to be published. The Houdini box did well. It won something called the Texas Bluebonnet Award, which is an award that's voted on by all the children of Texas, which means that all the children of Texas have to read your book, which means all the libraries and schools of Texas have to buy your book. Being on the nomination list is really the big thing, because that's where the sales come in, and it really makes a very, very big difference, especially for new authors and new books, to be able to essentially guarantee the sale of an entire print run is an extraordinary opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so when I got nominated, it was made very clear to me by the folks at Random House that that's the important part. But then I won, and I got to give a speech to about 3,000 Texas librarians. And for the next 10 years, I made most of my living by being invited to the libraries and schools of Texas, who I had met at that speech. They all invited me to come back to their schools and libraries to talk about my work in their school districts. But in the meantime, I continued to make books, but I would say for 6 or 7 years, everything I made either went out of print pretty quickly or just wasn't read widely at all. And I was making some money from the advances that I would get for these books, although that wasn't very much either, but it's industry standard, but not very much. And it wasn't until I did Frindle, and then I did a picture book called The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins and Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride. That was written, the first one was written by Barbara Curley, the second by Pam Munoz-Ryan, that I felt like people began to read the books that I was making for the first time in a very long time. And then I had what became a very, very good, solid career for a children's book illustrator, because it's hard to make a living doing what we do.
Right.
And I had a good career. I was paying my bills. I had books that people were reading. And then eventually it kind of settled into the series of picture book biographies that I was doing. Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride, The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, a book about the first Black opera singer to sing a lead role at the Met named Marian Anderson, and this picture book about Walt Whitman. It felt they were being very well read. I was getting some recognition for them in different ways, but it started to feel like that was all I was being offered. And I didn't have a lot of ideas for my own books. So I wrote and illustrated the Houdini box. And then I wrote and illustrated a book called The Robot King with another editor who I eventually started working with, named Laura Geringer at HarperCollins. And so after I had done these 4 picture book biographies and had some money and felt pretty good about the fact that I was working, I actually voluntarily stopped working because I didn't want to do any more picture book biographies, but I didn't know what else to do because I just didn't have a lot of ideas, as I mentioned. By coincidence, around that time, I first met Maurice Sendack and we became friends, and he didn't know my work, and so he asked me to send him a box of my books. He got them, and he called me and he's like, "Well, you probably want to know what I think." And I said, I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, you can draw, which isn't true of most illustrators, but none of these books reach the potential I see in you."
Wow.
And we got into a really interesting conversation about what that might mean. And basically, it came down to him saying that I need to make the book I want to make. I need to not wait for other people to tell me what to do. I sat with that for a while. I really didn't know how to interpret that.
Right.
I was partially thrown because, again, my work had been getting recognition by that point. Like, I thought I was pretty good. Like, I thought the books were pretty good. And a friend finally pointed out to me that Sendack must really love me in order to give me a critique that harsh. Yep. Because if he didn't love me and if he didn't care, he would have just said, "Oh, everything looks good, keep going." But that wasn't really like him anyway. And I basically just started, I don't know, reading whatever he happened to be mentioned he was reading. That's how I got into Herman Melville, because that's his one of his favorite writers. Started looking at paintings he was talking about and looking at reading poems that he would talk about, listen to music he was talking about. And I just kept thinking, like, what is it that I want to make? What's the book that I want to make? I remembered that after I made the Houdini box 15 years earlier, which is about a kid who gets to meet the magician Harry Houdini, I had the idea to make a story about a kid who meets the filmmaker George Méliès, who made A Trip to the Moon, where the rocket goes into the eye of the man in the moon. But I didn't have a plot. Like, I just thought, well, the Houdini box is about a kid who meets Houdini, so I can make a story about a kid who meets George Méliès. And that idea sat in the back of my head for 15 years until this conversation with Maurice Sendack and this period of time where I was feeling frustrated with my own work. And then, as happens very often, a very big coincidence occurred where I opened the newspaper the next day and found a review of a book called Edison's Eve by Gabby Wood about the history of automatons that talked about the French filmmaker Georges Méliès, who had a collection of automatons that were destroyed and thrown away at the end of his life. And I just pictured a kid rescuing one of those machines and trying to fix it. Mm-hmm. And then, everything sort of took off from there.
You won the Caldecott Medal for that book, right?
Yes, I guess I did.
my heart just dropped out of my chest. Like, oh no, my research is wrong. I often ask when I have a Caldecott Medal winner on, or honor winner, I ask them, like, where were they when they got the call? I love the question because the answers are so wildly different, and they're often funny. Where were you when you got the call?
I was in California. My husband teaches at UC San Diego.
Nice.
And my phone rang at about 3:30 in the morning.
Of course.
I think by that point, people had been talking about Hugo and the Caldecott. They had made it very clear publicly that the book was not eligible for the Caldecott.
What?
Because of the way the rules work, because the book's a novel and no novel like this exactly had won the award. And it's chatter that sort of gets into your head, and it's a little bit hard to ignore. But
Brian, are you human? Is that what you're telling me?
It became pretty clear that the consensus publicly was that it wouldn't be eligible. But the second the phone rang on that day, you sort of know what might be happening.
Right.
I had won a Caldecott honor for the Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins in 2001. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I jumped out of bed. I got the phone. It was Karen Breen, the head of the Caldecott committee, telling me that Hugo had won the Caldecott. Ugh. I'm pretty sure I burst into tears.
Yeah, I would.
And I was on a plane to New York within 3 hours. But I hung up the phone, and my husband also figured out what was going on. And I had spent 3 years making that book, which is about a kid who loves French silent movies, which is not a guaranteed bestseller idea. And
no pirates, no mermaids, no axolotls.
I have a lot of worry. I spent a lot of those 3 years feeling very, just very insecure in a lot of ways. I was proud of the book when I finished it, but I just had no idea what anybody was going to make of it, what anybody was going to think of it, if anybody would read it. So the first thing that my husband said to me after I hung up the phone was, "Now do you think it's a good book?" It didn't take the Caldecott Medal to convince me that Hugo was a good book. I knew the book was good when I finished it. Mm-hmm. And that's different than knowing if anyone's going to read it. Yeah. And I knew that I had made the story I set out to make, even though I didn't know what the story was when I began. I knew that I had learned a lot about storytelling, about using images mm-hmm. in a narrative. I had never made a book like Hugo before. I was inspired by things like The Wild Rumpus and Where the Wild Things Are, where the pictures take over the book and just move the narrative forward. Yep. There's no white space. There's no text. Nope. Right. Mm-hmm. So I knew that even if nobody read it and or liked the book, I loved what I had made and I had learned a lot from it, and I would take everything I had learned to just make another book. That's sort of what my plan was. So the Caldecott didn't tell me anything it didn't tell me anything I didn't know. Like, I knew it was a good book, but getting that kind of recognition and knowing the history of that award and knowing that it connected me very directly to Maurice Sendack, who by this point I had become very good friends with mm-hmm. him. I felt the strength, like I felt the weight of that. I felt extremely proud, and I enjoyed it. Like I was able to deeply enjoy and appreciate the entire experience. And by this point, Remy Charlip, who had illustrated all my favorite books, I mentioned he mm-hmm. posed as Georges Méliès. Mm-hmm. He had had a massive stroke and was no longer able to communicate, but I was able to bring him with his caretaker to the Caldecott ceremony.
Amazing.
And not, like the people who know Remy Charlip's work love it very much, but not everybody knows his work.
Oh,
and so I
huge
think,
fan.
yeah, and I think as he was growing older, there may have been like a sense of frustration that maybe more people didn't know his work, and because he's made so many brilliant books.
Yeah.
But during my speech, I told the story about meeting him and asking him to pose for me, and then I told the 3,000 librarians in the room that Remy Charlip was here with us. There's video cameras that go around the audience, and there's the big screens, and the camera found him in the audience. He stood up, he waved, and 3,000 librarians gave him a standing ovation.
Oh.
And I thought to myself, I think this might be why I won. I think I might have made all of this so that Remy could have this experience. And that made me feel very, very proud.
Well, I don't know how this is going to sound, so I'm going to just stop caring about how I sound and just speak from the heart. I want to thank you for that, because I am a huge fan of Remy Charlip's, and I'm doing my part, Brian. Every week, I will bring his name up at least once with an illustrator and be like, look at this person. You need to look at this artist. One of my easily top 10 favorite illustrators, no doubt, probably top 5. So thanks for that. I didn't know that, and now I feel a lot better about his career and his life.
You. Yeah, and more people can go and pick up his books and take a look.
Speaking of knowing people, get ready to blush, Brian. You're seen as a celebrity in children's publishing. Whether you agree with that or not, you are. You've been called, these are not my words, these are other people's words, a literary icon, a superstar, one librarian who embellishes like ChatGPT run amok called you a, quote, beloved figure. Does that bother you? Or is it a source of some pride? You mentioned a little pride earlier. Or do you not have the foggiest idea what I'm talking about?
That's amazing. I feel bad for anyone who's called any of those things and who might say they don't like it or feel like that's a compliment. But does it resonate with me and does it affect or reflect how I think of myself? No, it does not. Right? I think of myself as the person sitting at the desk figuring out what my next story is going to be. I'm the person sitting at the desk trying to make the drawing look the way I want it to look and feeling frustrated because I'm not sure if I'm technically capable of doing it. So I have to sort of push myself and try this new thing or try, I'm very conscious of trying to make, when I'm making a book, that I'm trying to not do what I did last time, but to take what I did last time and learn from it and do something new with it, which sort of places you on the edge of failure all the time because you haven't actually done the thing you're doing, which doesn't get, there's just never any guarantees. And, so, if those words and something like the Caldecott Medal do something, they do offer a kind of comfort, right? Like they do. Right. I am aware of that. Like I won the Caldecott Medal. I'm looking at it right now. It's in a cabinet to the left of my desk. I can see it sort of in shadows under a shelf, but I can see it. That's great. I was given that. And no matter what happens, and if no one reads any book I ever make again, no one's going to take away the Caldecott Medal that I won and all of those positive experiences I had and all the fun stories that accompanied it. It is nice that it can offer a kind of comfort in those moments every now and then when these words are brought up or when someone mentions the Caldecott Medal. Right. But in terms of my day-to-day life as a person who makes books for young people, none of that is present. It's not, I don't know. It's not that it feels like I'm not, I don't feel like I'm two different people. It's all the same. I'm cohesive. It's all me. But what that indicates to me is I've made books that people like. And that's the goal, right? Is to make a story that people relate to and that they want to share and they want to read. And now I've been making books long enough that I have a lot of adults come up to me and say, I grew up with your books. I got into cinema because I read Hugo. I became this because I read your book. Your book gave me comfort when I most needed it. Your book offered me this. And that's incredible. I love that. And I'm just at the end of a big tour for Run Away With Me. It's my first young adult novel. I've never written a queer young adult novel before. I've been talking to people all over the country in red states and blue cities and red states and red cities and blue states, talking about this new book and talking to people about their experiences with my previous books. And it's great. Like, it offers a little bit of stability in a world that's particularly destabilizing at the moment. So I'm very glad for that, very appreciative for that. Ultimately, what feels the most real is the time that I'm sitting at the desk and I can't quite figure out what happens next, and I have to struggle with that.
Yeah. You mentioned Run Away With Me a couple of times, and just for folks who aren't totally familiar, so obviously you've written it and illustrated it. It was published by Scholastic in April of 25. It is a young adult book. Yes. You said it was your first, so that's not easy. It's a coming-of-age tale that explores teen love between Danny and Angelo, who is the name of one of my favorite uncles. Like, may he rest in peace. Zio Angelo. And it takes place in my favorite city, Rome. Like, let's not talk about the Bernini statues you drew and included in the book, because we will be here all day. But I did see those illustrations, and goodness gracious, gorgeous. So here's the question. You were born in 1966, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
It's been a minute since you've been a teen.
Yes.
It's been a minute since you came out, and you did not come out when you were a teenager. You came out when you were 26.
Yes.
How did you, and how do you tap into a voice of which you don't necessarily have complete firsthand knowledge?
You make it up. And
and that's the end of the episode. No, go ahead.
You make it up and you go with what you remember. So, I think maybe one of the reasons I write for young people is because I still feel like the young people who I was are very present tense in me. I remember being 10, 12, 16 very clearly in a lot of ways. I've been making books for 34 years. My first character was 10. And then about 15 years later, they were, Hugo was 13.
Right.
And then
someone's trying to steal a car outside.
Oh, yeah. Let me see if that...
Is that your car?
I was hoping you couldn't hear that.
Let's double check that's not your car and someone's not driving away.
Yeah, no, luckily I don't have a car, so I know it's not mine. Let's see if it stops. Otherwise, I can try to move in. Oh, there we go. So I remember the 10-year-old that I was, the 13-year-old, and my first book 34 years ago, the main character was 10, and then 15 years later, the main character was about 12 or 13.
Right.
And then over the next 9 years or so, the characters got a little bit older, and now I'm writing these 16-year-old boys. So the inner child that I've been writing about has slowly been growing up over the past 34 years, I suppose, is one way to look at it. When I was 30 when I first fell in love, and probably 22 when I really started dating. I would imagine that the act of falling in love, the feelings, the emotions translate across whatever age you may be. And so that there are parallels. And then there are other things about being 16, being a young person that I remember very specifically and very strongly that I actually consciously gave to the characters. Like I had asthma when I was a kid, and I had a big operation on my chest when I was 10, and I gave that to one of the characters. So there were those elements that I remember very clearly from my childhood that I gave. And then the rest of it really was just making it up and going by instinct about like, what would a 16-year-old be comfortable with? What would a 16-year-old, or not just a 16-year-old, what would this 16-year-old, right? Because like no one speaks for everybody. So I'm writing a specific character. And so what would this 16-year-old be okay with? What would this 16-year-old be afraid of? What would this 16-year-old be dealing with? And what is his mother like? I knew when I was writing the book that I didn't want to do a coming out scene. I didn't want there to be any violence. I didn't want there to be any gay bashing. There were certain tropes that you often see in queer young adult literature that I knew I consciously wanted to avoid.
Right.
But other than that, I didn't know where the story was going to go, so I was open to lots of different things. In terms of figuring it out, I'm just going to wait for the siren to
I was
pass.
just going to say, I mean, it's like a whole story in the background here. Someone stole a car, and now the police are going after them.
There is a lot happening narratively in my neighborhood.
Lots of details
right
in
now.
the background, Brian.
Oh my God! All right, I think they're. Are they moving on or are they parking? Let's see. Oh, I think it's getting quieter. Just when you think it's getting quieter, it seems to circle around again. All right, can you still hear that? Less so.
He's just driving around the block looking for the culprit. I mean, this sounds cliche, but I guess it's tapping into your inner child really does help.
I don't know. You have a problem with the word detail. I don't really love the phrase inner child. It has a little twee kind of cliched connection to thoughts around it. But the idea that we are one person who has been alive since our birth.
Right.
And if you're open to other thoughts, perhaps longer than that. But there's a continuity from the person who we are when we're 3, 5, 10, 15 to when we're 30, 50, whatever age we are. Mm-hmm. And
29
hopefully
over here.
Right. Hopefully we're growing. Hopefully we're adjusting and changing.
Right.
Sometimes we've had trauma that we try to forget. Sometimes we have trauma that we're trying to integrate into who we are so we can live with it. Or if we've experienced grief, we might be trying to figure out how to integrate it with our own lives. But we're still, or at least I feel like I'm still the same person.
Right.
So when I write about a 10-year-old, I don't feel like it's my inner, quote unquote, inner child. I don't feel like it's a foreign entity in any way other than making up a character of any age is someone else. Mm-hmm. I'm making up a person, and the person I'm making up happens to be that age, happens to be 10, and then therefore the things that they're thinking about and the things that they're experiencing are being experienced by someone that age. But no two 10-year-olds are alike. It's all going to come down to what it is that particular person is interested in, what they're able to do, what their circumstances are in the world, what makes them safe, what makes them unsafe. I don't feel like I'm writing about an inner child. I don't feel like I'm in touch with my, again, quote unquote, inner child. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm in touch with me, and I'm pretty good at remembering a lot of things that happened to me and what I was thinking when I was these ages. And my characters often do connect with me when I was younger. But also, right. I'm giving 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds things that I'm interested in now as a person in my, that I've been interested in my 40s and 50s. Like, I wasn't interested in the history of museums or French silent movies or deaf history when I was a kid. Those are things that interest me as an adult, and those are the things I want to write about now. And so that's what I'm giving to the kids who I'm writing about, and finding ways for them to be interested in and experiencing the things that interest me now, because I'm an adult and I'm a writer and I make up stories, mm-hmm. and I follow the age of the characters that essentially come to me. And so far they've been like 10 to 16 years old.
Yeah. Turning our attention to the listener and to future Runaway With Me readers, what other piece of advice or word of wisdom would you like to share with them directly?
Oh, I don't know. I'm so bad at advice. Like,
no, you're not.
I'm very interested.
You're not. I've read plenty of your interviews and I've listened to plenty of podcasts. No, you're not.
Thank you. But I think what I'm interested in is responding to questions and to having conversations, because I have been working for a long time. I have experienced a lot of things. I do have a lot of thoughts about things, but we all need to figure things out for ourselves, right? So the need to experiment, the need to fail, the need to try different things is, to me, what's most important, and the thing that I keep finding for myself. Like, I always find that anything that seems to be like a guideline or specific advice about what you do in this situation or that situation, or how do you handle this kind of element in a story or that kind of element in a story, is going to change depending on what the story is and what you need to be doing in that particular moment in the narrative. So when I had made 3 or 4 books, I made the Houdini box, then I made a couple other books, and I was always very proud of what I did, and I was happy to be working. But someone asked me if I thought my work was getting better at that point. After, again, this was just like after I made 3 or 4 books, and after the Houdini box, nobody really was reading those other books. And I remember thinking, wow, the Houdini box is really good. Like, I still, I love reading it. It still feels very positive, but I can't say the other books, and I like the other books, but I can't say they're better. So from that moment forward, like I was saying earlier, like, it has become a conscious desire for me to try to improve for myself on what I have made previously. And again, that doesn't mean sell more books or have more readers. It means, do I think the story is better? Have I used pictures in a way that I haven't used them before? Have I found a new way to illustrate a story for myself? Right? I'm comparing. The trick is to compare myself to me and not to compare myself to other people. So there are many other people like Chris van Allsburg, like Maurice Sendack, like Remy Charlip, from whom I have taken many lessons, from whom I have learned. And Edward Gorey is the other illustrator, I should say, who's been incredibly influential on how I think about images. Because Gorey, I think one of the brilliant things about Edward Gorey is he often draws the thing leading up to the moment. He sometimes draws the thing after the moment. He sometimes draws the thing in the room next to the moment. What he very rarely draws is the moment. And so you're constantly being asked to, as we were talking about earlier, do some of that work so that you see the thing falling, but you don't see it having hit the character yet, or you have a line of text that tells you what's going to happen, and so you're able to complete the story between the words and whatever the picture happens to be. So I've gleaned a lot from Edward Gorey, and you can look at a lot of my drawings and be like, oh, I see, like that foot disappearing behind that doorway is very much like Edward Gorey doing this or like that. But again, I'm trying to do something for myself with it. If any of that accidentally feels like advice, I guess that's what I would have to say.
To learn more about Brian, visit brianselznick.com. If you find value in this podcast, you can support it by subscribing to my best-selling Substack. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you will access hundreds of articles on the art, practice, and history of illustration, unlock bonus podcast episodes called Extra Credit, and connect with other members of the ID community. Join me on Substack by visiting illustrationdEPT.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
Amazon presents Lisa versus the Mosquito. Surviving 100 million years, mosquitoes shook off the plate tectonic breakup of Pangaea, the asteroid that eliminated the dinosaurs and the Ice Age. But Lisa shopped on Amazon and bought a can of repellent, a cute long-sleeve shirt, and a citronella candle. Hey, mosquito, Lisa just bodied you. Save the everyday with deals from Amazon.